We're testing, testing, testing. We're testing, testing, testing. So the mic's just a little loud. Let's fix that. Alright. Okay, then let's get started, shall we? Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today's conversation will be about the big debate and the easiest answer to should we allow hitbox to be in tournament, and my opinion on what we should do about this. So we need to explain exactly what a hitbox is and how it relates to the fighting game tournament scene now. As everyone has thoroughly known, it's been more preferable that the use of fighting game pads, such as these, to have a normal D-pad, regular left stick or right stick, and 4 face buttons and top triggers, 2 regular button triggers and 2 regular back triggers, whether they be actual shooting triggers or actual button triggers, like sort of to a fighting commander controller, such as this right here, where they are just buttons. If it's not too hard to see, where they are just 2 top buttons, where these types of pads are capable. And we have arcade sticks, such as these, which have levers, where this is the actual functionable lever. There are usually 3 to 4 buttons, depending on the maker of the arcade stick in question and how many buttons exist on the default layout. Now, what we're talking about today is we're talking mainly about what's known as a leverless controller, or a arcade stick without a lever, which is purely mechanical. It acts somewhat like a keyboard, but it's not exactly a keyboard. But it works pretty similarly. The best example I can give you is, let's use a actual hitbox. Let's show you what a hitbox looks like. This isn't exactly a hitbox, but I will explain. Sorry about that. My OBS decided to drop out for some strange reason, but let's continue. So, what I'm going to show is we'll show an image of one. We'll show an image of what a hitbox looks like, particularly. So we'll use this as an example. Okay, so you see this right here? This is exactly what's known as a leverless controller, where the lever on a typical arcade stick is actually replaced by mechanical buttons, where a button stands for each direction, whereas you have somewhat of the control right here standing for left, this controller standing for down, this controller standing for right, and this button right here standing for right, and down here is the button standing for up, where you have the typical 4 arcade buttons. Now, there are other leverless controllers, such as, and I will also pull this up for you, give me 1 second, what is known as the Mixbox, which is actually a little more easily explainable, where the concept of where on a hitbox where the buttons look somewhat similar to 1, 2, 3, and where the jump button is down here, and where this is still gone, the lever is still gone, but this is now just replaced with the regular WASD layout, that you would find in a regular default keyboard, which is somewhat a familiar shape to those who play on the keyboard. Now, the big conversation is, because there happens to be a significant amount of advantages when it comes to sort of leverless controllers, and they being more mechanical, and arcade sticks being more, more disadvantaged due to their lack of being purely mechanical. I'll just pull these up for you so it's easier to recognize. Much more easier to reference, actually. So it'll be a lot easier for you to reference. And the whole question is whether or not these two controllers are what's known as too advantageous for a tournament, for competition. Now, the argument for them being too advantageous is because these are purely mechanical, they are what you would call faster for reaction times. A lot more pros that play fighting games specifically would note the fact that since they are highly mechanical and function somewhat similar to a keyboard, as I've repeated, sorry for repeating more than twice. Is that the reaction times when you're playing a game that is very insistent on the amount on how fast you can react in any situation, where a win and a loss can come down to frames, are literally a question of day and night. Now, what the secondary argument for this not being an issue is that as you take away controllers, you sort of take away accessibility for all players who want to play any game. Because as far as we understand, a lot of people who are playing and fighting in tournaments at first just have regular pads that they would get from buying the console strictly, and not many people have the money for an arcade stick. Plus, much like arcade sticks, leverless controllers are even more, if not further difficult than it is to learn to get used to, because now you're losing the ability of learning to go like left and right or up and down, and or doing regular motions, and now you're replacing them with just button hits. And so now it's a very big question. Oh my god, am I gonna kill my OBS? Okay, no. Okay, I'm good. So, I will argue right now for the point of Hitbox being capable of still being in tournament. The adjust times for when you play leverless controller is actually very much what you would call a very, very high skill ceiling, due to your ability of having already learned how to use an arcade stick, and the ability of having your hands be in this position, mainly a typing position, for a majority of the time. And because this is usually how your hands would be most of the time, you're usually typing like this and usually sporadic motions or trying to do inputs very fast, and that in turn puts as much strain on the hands if you're typing, much like carpal tunnel you would get from using a lever. It's much more prevalent because now you're doing the same motions often in a typing form. Plus, there has been another revolutionary for another revolutionary bit of creativity for hitboxes and or leveless controllers, and that is the concept of SOCD, which in turn stands for simultaneous opposite cardinal directions, that being up, down, left, and right. Because games are aware that these types of controllers do exist, they have had something that is known as SOCD cleaning, or simultaneous opposite cardinal direction cleaning, whereas either hardware being literally the stick itself or software being the game that's being played would say that if the up and down buttons of a leveless controller are hit at the same time, it would input up, and where if the left and right buttons of a leveless controller are hit at the same time, they would input neutral, which is no direction. Sorry. That in turn is the argument for that, saying that they've given a lot of rules, making it somewhat near fair for competition. Saying that, well, there are rules, and just because they're buttons don't mean that they don't have to succumb to these rules, and if they don't succumb to these rules, then they're not legal. So we wouldn't allow them. However, let's now talk about the negatives of either playing with a hitbox or playing against a hitbox. Well, see, realistically, when you're going button versus lever, in this case, the lever has to go from one direction to the other side. And that usually is a longer duration of time than it is from pressing one button to press another button. So realistically, you can be as fast as this as you want, but a button press is fast pressing a button, which is usually faster. And we all know how fast typing is, but we all know how limited the hand can be, because you only get slower with time, and as fast as your reactions can be, going left and right with your hand using a lever that only goes left and right will always lose to the possibility of being able to press two buttons as fast as possible. So, a lot of older people or current people have been calling the hitbox the cheater box because of the glaring advantages that a leveless controller would have, be it the Mixbox or the hitbox, but preferably the hitbox in this case, because it does show a lot more preferability in being used for tournaments. Plus, they do have a lot more professionals that are willing to now move over to that type of control scheme because it's more advantageous for competition. So now comes the major question of, should you allow a hitbox in tournament? By the rules of, on paper, it sounds like it shouldn't. It's giving too much of a glaring advantage against those who are using levers and or pads. So it feels as if the hitbox should not be allowed. But I hadn't told you one particular thing at about why the hitbox is fair and why the pad is unfair in its own way. So let's just say in our glaring rules we say that anything that has the possibility of not being able to have simultaneous opposite cardinal direction cleaning be possible within its own hardware. Let's say it's the hardware, the literal controller itself, that has to dictate it and not the game. Because that is another argument, that instead of putting it within the controller itself, we let the game determine it. So there's cases where the hardware will only send out those particular things, that being the down and up means up and the left and right meaning neutral, where the controller would do this, the hardware, or you make the software do it. If you make the software do it, then regardless of whatever hits it, whatever is left and right will be neutral, and whatever is up and down will act as up. And so I imagine a lot of you were saying, oh, so we should be allowed to have hitboxes, right? A lot of people are still saying no. Well, let's ban it. Well, what people do realize and also understand is that if you ban anything that has the ability to tap for simultaneous directions, as that you would have to ban pads as well. Because for even as impossible as this looks, and as silly as this sounds, this also has the possibility of doing simultaneous opposite cardinal directions unclean. Because a pad is not designed to worry about you pressing two different directions at once. And you see right here, I'm doing both a back and a front on this controller, a back on the left stick, and a back on the D and a right on the D-pad, or a right on the left stick and a left on the D-pad. Mind you, in fighting games, these two are basically the same control. No game besides Tekken has ever asked you to which one is controlling what input. Because a lot of games, if they're not like defaultly set, because sometimes this can just stand for the D-pad, so when you set this, it automatically in turn sets this. Or if there's not a game where this is separate from this, then this will also still mean this. So in turn, this is still back and front. And this is still down and up. As this is down and up. And this is back and front. So then you'd also have to ban this, right? Well, no, because now we're taking something else to account. Accessibility. If you take away a controller, you take away all the players that use that controller, which usually means it comes out in lower numbers. And a lot more people use pad than they do use hitbox or arcade stick. Just because the fighting game community may be small does not mean that there aren't a majority of people who don't use pad. So, now it's time for the most important part of this video. What I believe is the natural solution. Now, it may be brutal, but I want you to hear me out. The answer to this is actually the easiest answer possible. And it's gonna sound like I'm being very tone deaf, but then again, realize why I'm saying it and how I'm saying it. You can choose to ban the hitbox, but then you must also consider that you have to ban the pad. And if you are not willing to ban the pad, then you are not willing to ban the hitbox. And so now you have these two controllers that have the possibility of doing those directions. And you've allowed something that has that unfair prospect into the circle without letting the other one exist. So now it's perfectly unfair. So you either eliminate the hitbox and the pad and only allow arcade stick, or you allow arcade stick and any leverless controller along with pads. My particular answer would be, if you are not comfortable with hitbox, ban hitbox and pads. Since you are a tournament organizer, if you have enough levity within the fighting game community, you should be able to find an equal number of people who use arcade sticks or pads, depending on the game. If the game's newer, then everyone's most likely to use pads because it's more designed towards pads. However, has anyone else noticed that both a PS5 pad and a PS4 pad are not designed for fighting games at all? Realistically, I don't think triggers in the back here work well for fighting games. Particularly because these don't have a functionable design. What is an ergonomic trigger going to do for a kick? I don't know. So my argument here is that realistically, people who play on pads, you should not feel bad for playing on pad. Ever. Don't feel bad about playing on pad. It's all new. It's newer. It's basically how everyone's been playing fighting games for their entire life. We've always had that control possible. But perfectly understand what a tournament organizer has to go through. He has to decide whether or not you can even play, because he has to decide whether or not a hitbox is fair. And if a hitbox is unfair, then your pad is unfair. And we just can't let pads go willy-nilly, because that's letting anything go willy-nilly. So, I'll sum it up and end it like this. The fighting game community, this is who I'm speaking to. You have to understand that different controllers exist. And different advantages exist. But at the end of the day, the only person who is complaining about a controller being an advantage are the people who don't play that controller. And I don't see where it's coming from, because I could swear that the finals for EVO was a pad and a hitbox. Two way different things. Something that comes with a console, something that doesn't come with a console. It's essentially like a controller versus a keyboard. And if everyone is gonna spend the majority of time talking about whether or not a hitbox is unfair to fighting games, and if a pad should even be legal for fighting games, I will be as blunt a person as anyone will be. Don't use a pad for fighting games. Don't use a hitbox for fighting games. Use an arcade stick for fighting games. Because all I've realistically done is that I've set the playing field to one type of keyboard, to one type of controller. Everyone has to adapt to it. Everyone has to follow the rules. Games are already aware of this type of control scheme. There's nothing special about this controller that needs to have a game fix specifically. I understand it's a lack of accessibility, but at the end of the day, I'm creating the fairest playing field possible. Because if you're afraid of something as simple as an all button controller dominating a fighting game, then you need to set the playing field as even as possible. And putting in either all arcade stick or all pads as a possibility, then that should probably be your answer. Do not be afraid to set those rules. Everyone's gonna complain about something. Not everybody plays stick. Not everybody plays pad. Not everybody plays hitbox. But understand me when I say this. I may have said all pads, because even pads eliminates the hitbox and everyone plays on the same playing surface. A pad. You're playing on just a pad. It can only go as advanced as the pad. And it's not like a pad is difficult at first. This is the first thing you learn it from. When you buy the console, this is the pad. This is the thing you learn it from first. Unless you automatically spent $500 on an arcade stick and are bought it on a PC and are playing it on a streaming service, or like a game streaming service. You're either playing it on Steam or the Epic Game Store or some other thing. Literally, you would either play on pad first and then keep playing on pad, or you would eventually stop playing on pad once you buy this, and then you'll just be right back used to your controls, and it'll just feel like a field. So, without me babbling any further, my answer to this simple solution is you either ban pad and hitbox and allow only arcade stick, or you ban arcade stick and hitbox and allow only pads. Because it puts the playing field even, and it limits everyone to the ability to learn the controller in question, and it shows how proficient someone can learn either an arcade stick or a pad, and can most preferably at the end of the day make some of the lowest people shine, or make some of the most professional people still look as good as they are, or keep all the older people, right in pace, because they'll feel right at home on a arcade stick, or keep all the newer people happy because it's like right at a pad and they're just so used to using pad. But it's a case-by-case basis. But you've already heard my opinion. What's yours? Feel free to leave it in the comments, and let's have a talk about this, because as far as I understand, a lot of us are fickle, and we won't accept any explanation as being the exact answer. So, I'll open it up for a conversation, and however many comments I get, I'll answer it as soon as possible, or whenever I get the next opportunity to answer. So, until then, take some time to think about the number of competitors you want versus how fair you want the playing field. Because whether you like it or not, the playing field will always be leveraged to those with the greatest advantage, and almost every single control scheme has an advantage and a disadvantage. Have a good night.